4th Energy and Resources Forum here at the Rolex Arena. Lovely to see some new faces who have joined. And we were talking this, just before, we were talking about housing and things that can empower each and every individual. And that's what we're going to do all day, because it's all about moving the immovable, this big elephant, trying to get people to comply, trying to get people to come along and do actually something about this big environmental change that's ahead of us. And it is difficult. I mean, yeah, if you like a steak fillet, you just do. And then leave it because, yeah, maybe you do, but maybe you don't, you know? Or if you have an old-timer that runs on fuel, it's your grandpa's car. He gave it to you, and it's just really, wow, nice. And, you know, and so there's a lot of things that we cling on to, or a beautiful old apartment, even though it's too big. We heard that beforehand, and it would be smart to give it to a family with 3 kids. If moving to a new apartment is 3 times more expensive, probably you won't do it. So how do you move the immovable? One part, or one way you can do that is through language, storytelling. How can you talk to people so that they overcome fear or anxiety, but they start to be motivated and get into action? That's what this masterclass is going to be about. And I'm really thrilled to introduce to you Amy Player. She's a researcher at the University of Lausanne in the Faculty of Art. And what she does is she researches how authors write about nature, the power of storytelling, and how to get from frustration to motivation. Can I say it that way?
It's a good way of talking about it.
A very warm welcome to Amy Player.
Thanks very much, Karen. Hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you all today as part of this masterclass. And today we'll be looking at the ways in which literature and nature writing specifically can engage with the environmental crisis. So I'll be addressing why thinking about the language we use to talk about these issues is so important, and also why a careful consideration of the stories and the narratives that we use to talk about it are vitally important too. So I wanted to start today's talk with a question which serves as a sort of touchstone for much of the contemporary environmental literature that I'll be talking about today. So this comes from the Scottish nature writer Kathleen Jamie. So she asks simply, and what's natural? She adds to this, we're having to replant the forests we cleared, and there's even talk of reintroducing that natural predator, the wolf. So I take this as a starting example today because a questioning approach to what exactly constitutes literature, what constitutes nature, and where certain boundaries or distinctions lie when we attempt to define it, and the extent to which our definitions of nature are also reflections on the culture and the society that we live in, have been key issues for contemporary nature writers in recent years. Now, when I say contemporary nature writing, sometimes also called new nature writing, I'm essentially referring to writing from the past few decades about nature, which is often very loosely defined, and our relationship with it. And it's really gained in critical and popular acclaim in recent years. Now, of course, nature writing is not confined to any specific time period or culture or movement, but the critic Deborah Lilly argues that this new contemporary nature writing has been made more urgent, and she says, and also less certain by the ecological crisis. And for me, I think this urgency is what is key. So much of it encourages us to reframe and rethink our relationship with nature. This is done both by unsettling the forms and the conventions that we associate with this sort of writing, but also by trying to unsettle our notions of what exactly nature is. So the best contemporary nature writing unflinchingly confronts the realities of our times, and it also addresses the expansiveness of our human influence on the planet and our often complex entanglement with it. So I also situate it as part of a broader cultural reimagining, which makes us rethink the narratives and stories we use as well. particularly by reflecting on what it means to be human on this planet in the Anthropocene, and what an understanding of this means for our relationship with what David Abram has called the more than human world. Now, the Anthropocene epoch is viewed as a period which marks a new geological era, which serves as a record of human influence on the planet. Now, the nature writer Robert Macfarlane defines this more specifically as a new epoch of geological time in which human activity is considered such a powerful influence, he says, which will leave a long-term signature in the strata record. And he adds, and what a signature it will be. We have bored 50 million kilometers of holes in our search for oil. We remove mountaintops to get at the coal they contain. We have become titanic geological agents, our legacy legible for millennia to come. Now, for David Roberts, one of the key problems with coming to terms with the idea of the Anthropocene is what he says is the deeply entrenched belief that humans are not capable of planetary scale impacts. Now, there's a strange duality in the Anthropocene because it both confirms the mammoth imprint that we have had, but it also confirms how we are as a species comparatively fleeting in the much broader temporal arc of deep time, which I'll get to in a little bit. Now, referring to the challenges we face in the Anthropocene, James Bradley has argued that not only must we confront the inhuman scale of the transformation that is taking place, its temporal, physical, and moral enormity, but we must find ways of making sense of its complexity and interconnectedness, and communicate ideas, he says, which are not just uncomfortable and frightening, but actively difficult to comprehend. And this is where I'd argue that literature can come in, by offering precisely the sorts of narratives which challenge the position that humans are not capable of planetary scale impacts, amongst others, by helping us to come to terms with the changes we are seeing, but also crucially by suggesting ways that we can move forward with the weight of this knowledge. Now, another problem to the idea of the Anthropocene I should mention at this stage, which perhaps many of you are already familiar with, is that around a year ago, after several decades of debates, the term was in fact rejected by the International Union of Geological Sciences, particularly as a formal geological term. Now, I won't go into detail over the debates around the terms and the suggested alternatives now, but I just wanted to mention this in the context of me using the term today. So as far as I'm concerned, the horse has already bolted, as the cultural impact of the term continues to be important. So the Geological Society acknowledge also that, in their words, the term Anthropocene will continue to be widely used not only by earth and environmental scientists, they say, but also by social scientists, politicians, and economists, as well as the public at large. As such, they say, it will remain an invaluable descriptor in human-environment interactions. So it's in this sense that I'm using it here, more as a collective acceptance of human influence on the planet, more broadly speaking, and also as a useful term to group together this expansive idea. So I'll be discussing some examples from some key contemporary nature writers today who are helping us to reframe ideas of nature and are creating new narratives of nature which help to reflect this sense of complexity and interconnectedness. Now, we first have Robert Macfarlane. He is a British writer who is one of the most prolific and influential writers in this contemporary nature writing movement in Britain. He is, amongst other things, a writer, a critic, and also an academic, and he is highly responsive to the representational challenges of the Anthropocene in his work. Then we have the Scottish writer Kathleen Jamie. Now, Kathleen Jamie is first and foremost a poet, but she's also become increasingly well-known as a prose writer in recent years. Her prose writing reflects her sharpened qualities of attentiveness and foregrounds the importance of patient watching and listening. And finally, we have the British writer J. Griffiths. She has a writing style which is lyrical and elaborate, and it is also often highly charged. It's emotional and often very polemical, which in turn raises some questions about the role that new nature writing can have in relation to political activism as well. So I just wanted to ask you a general question now. Out of interest, I'm curious if any of you are already familiar with any of these three writers or any other contemporary nature writers at this point. if so, would you like to venture just a name or even just a nod of agreement? I'm just curious of the sort of the reach, potentially. Okay.
And I enjoyed it very much. I can recommend it to everybody.
Great, thank you. Yes, excellent. I think, Robert Macfarlane is certainly the author who has the broadest reach. He has been referred to amongst the nature writing circles as the Brad Pitt of nature writing. He is often the sort of the go-to writer, absolutely, yes. Any others also familiar with Robert Macfarlane, perhaps, or any of the other writers? No. Okay. So some people have asked why contemporary nature writing in particular has had such a resurgence in recent years. And they've questioned if the burgeoning public interest in this writing might be either consolatory or even escapist in some ways, particularly when so much of the natural world it describes is in such a precarious state. I think this is an interesting question. Why is nature writing having such a resurgence now, and what does this say about our relationship to nature? Well, for one thing, new nature writing doesn't simply accept our state of environmental crisis as a foregone conclusion. And I think this is really important because at times like these, when we can often feel overwhelmed, helpless, and disenfranchised, it's really important to try and focus on what this writing can do, what sort of role it can have. So as a response to these kinds of criticisms, particularly about the idea of this writing being maybe consolatory or escapist, the nature writer Kathleen Jamie, she's argued, nowadays, in nature, or the environment, we are far from consoled. She says, it's in nature we find the most frightening changes, and the more alert nature writers are energized by that truth. Now, it's this alertness to the truth which I think animates the best nature writing, and there's also a sense of responsibility, also a sense of ethical responsibility that really comes to the fore in this writing, also in terms of how we engage with nature and talk about it, and also when thinking about the future legacies that our current actions will leave behind through this writing. Now, as a way of going into and interrogating some ideas of nature, I wanted to turn to an essay called Pathologies Now, which Jamie wrote in 2012 as part of an essay collection called Sightlines. Now, in this essay, she essentially reconsiders the way that we've reframed nature and redefines it as something which is not external to us, but which is also present inside of us too. It mostly takes place within the confines of a pathology lab in Scotland, and it's a location which is far removed from a conventional natural setting for nature writing. So after attending an environmental conference, she says, the foreshortened definition of nature was troubling me. She says, it's not all primroses and otters. There's our own intimate inner natural world, the body's weird shapes and forms, and sometimes they go awry. There are other species, not dolphins arching clear from the water, but the bacteria that can pull the rug from under us. I wondered if there was a distinction somewhere I had simply failed to understand. Now, Jamie argues that both death and illness are part of nature here, even if they are the sort of nature which we'd rather do without. And that our tendency to selectively frame what we consider to be natural is problematic. Now, I'd argue that we see a sort of new narrative of nature emerging here because, amongst other things, accepting that disease and illness are also a part of nature reflects a more complex and hybrid understanding of nature, which also better fits into our Anthropocene context. Now, for some also, this definition of nature is also a question and a problem of the terminology, the sort of language that we use. And so thinking about the ethical implications of the language that we use and how that frames our relationship with nature is also an important consideration. So for an example, the critic Cheryl Glotfelty talks about the term environment. She says it's problematic because enviro is anthropocentric, it's dualistic, and it implies that we humans are not we humans are at the center, surrounded by everything that is not us, the environment. Along similar lines, we also have the writer Leslie Marmon-Silko talking about problems with the term landscape. In her view, she says, landscape assumes the viewer is somehow outside or separate from the territory he or she surveys. Viewers are as much a part of the landscape as the boulders they stand on. There is no high mesa edge or mountain peak where one can stand and not immediately be part of all that surrounds. So by acknowledging that humans are always interwoven with their surroundings here, both Glotfelty and Silko try to privilege a relationship to language which recognizes our inherent entanglement with the more than human world. Now, I'm going to give you all an example now. So I'd like you to think of the word glacial. I'd like you to think now what you think of when you think of the word glacial. What sort of images does that evoke in your mind? What sort of landscapes do you think of initially when you think about that? I'd like you also to think about what sort of characteristics you think of when you think about a landscape that has a glacier, which is glacial. What sort of characteristics do we attribute to something which is glacial? Oh.
Yep.
Icy, cold. I think I can throw the... Does anyone else want to add something?
Yep.
Who else? Here you go.
I see. I view it as extreme cold, permafrost, maybe landscape of North Pole, South Pole.
Yep.
Just pass it on.
I see gray, cold, freezing, light blue, something I'm not comfortable in, somewhere I'm not welcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I reflect on this, and what comes up is albedo effect, so reflecting the energy back to the space.
Mm-hmm.
And also standing mountains together, because it's a glacier, also a glue for the mountain, not to melt down. That's it.
Great. Excellent, thank you. Yes, absolutely. These are very much the kinds of things which which really come to mind when we think about these ideas to do with a glacier, and if we think about something as being glacial. But also, in this context, we can also think about something which Robert Macfarlane has also talked about with this idea, in terms of this idea of trying to reset and reframe ideas of language, and really to try and think about how we can update certain forms of language we use to make them more germane to our contemporary times. So he talks about this in relation to the idea of glacial. So in his 2019 text, Underland, he says, "For centuries, the polar regions were conventionally imagined as inert," he says, "the frozen wastes of the north and south. But now, in the context of a warming planet, ice has become active again in our imaginations and landscapes." He says, "The frozen poles are melting, and the consequences of their melting are global." He says, "A glacial pace used to mean movement so slow as to be almost static. Today's glaciers, however, surge, retreat, and vanish." Now, this throws traditional and conventional ideas of the term glacial into question and stresses the importance of updating our vocabulary to reflect the changing dynamics of the environment, which is drastically changing too due to anthropogenic climate change. What it also underlines is the importance that our lexis, that our vocabulary, like the environment that it describes, should not remain immobile or static either, because it's important that we maintain this sort of questioning attitude too. Just put up here this example. Some of you might recognize the Oldenhorn, the mountain near Les Diablerets. which a few years ago was reported as having glacial retreat to the extent that a pass which hadn't been visible since roughly Roman times is becoming visible again. Just the idea of bringing this idea of a more sort of fluid glacial environment receding even more closer to home, and sort of thinking about resetting this idea of glacial as being something which doesn't really move on a very fast or large scale. So another way that writers have approached these environmental changes in narrative is often framed in terms of this question of enchantment versus disenchantment. So I wanted us to look at this excerpt from J. Griffith's text, Wild, from 2008, where she describes coming across a coral reef for the very first time. So she says, soft coral looks like feathery fireworks, blazing with sparks but wafting with current. There are fans of gold, elkhorn coral and octocoral, a white lattice feather skeleton and a lace shroud. A rope of coral hangs like a strand of necklace that has been underwater for years, moss crushed with diamonds, sapphires and shells. So here we have lyricism as a narrative strategy, which translates an enchanting experience to the reader, and it also conveys the profusion and diversity of life Griffiths encounters in this coral reef. Now, another thing I wanted to add also is that enchanting descriptions such as these reflect how there are also still experiences which instill wonder in the Anthropocene era, which I do think is an important thing to remind ourselves of, but also to remind us of what exactly we face to lose, as well as what we also need to protect. Now, you might ask, is such a narrative approach escapist or even relevant in the Anthropocene, especially what we now know about the parlous state of coral reefs today? So I wanted to add to this some ideas to do with enchantment that Griffiths has also engaged with. Because in a later essay, she revisits a coral reef a decade or so after the initial visit that she described. So here there's a drastic shift because she recounts with horror and disbelief the dramatic changes to the ecosystem that she sees. For instance, what she initially observed as a vibrant blue coral, she later realizes was in fact coral slowly dying. She says when coral gets too hot, it produces a chemical to try to protect itself from the heat. And this is what makes them luminesce in this unearthly way for a mysterious moment. It still lives, but it will die. And in this moment in between, it shines. And she calls it the coral's swan song. Now, here, Griffiths juxtaposes ethereal but also troublingly beautiful luminescence to provide a very visual framing of the tragedy which is unfolding here. In contrast to her earlier description, when it comes to disenchanting experiences such as these, Griffiths actually shifts to bare, factual descriptions which are devoid of lyricism and embellishment to show how the reef is similarly devoid of life. She later writes, in the summer of 2015, more than 2 billion corals lived in the Great Barrier Reef. Half have now been killed, largely due to the crisis of climate change and the overheating of the oceans. 99% of the Great Barrier Reef suffers some level of bleaching. 29% of it died in 2016, and it just goes on. Now, the new reality that Griffiths is confronted with here is made even more horrifying by the speed at which it has occurred. It's something which she has seen in her own eyes and in her own lifetime. And just for context here, a period of about 10 years has elapsed between these two visits that she undertakes, which is just horrifying. But with these two versions of her experience, she rewrites the realities of the reef into what I see as a kind of counter-narrative to environmental loss and destruction. This not only reflects the new reality of our influence on the Anthropocene, but it also serves as another example of this sort of new narrative of nature, which we see emerging, which acknowledges our human influence in the Anthropocene, but it's also a response which acknowledges these new realities, which, to recall Jamie from earlier, are also part of these frightening changes. But I'd argue that Griffiths is energized by the truth because by creating this sort of counter-narrative here, she stresses how our current behaviors and attitudes cannot be sustained. Now, as an alternative way of reframing these narratives of enchantment, I wanted to turn to one of Jamie's essays where she recounts a trip taken to Greenland, and she describes her experience of observing the Northern Lights. She writes, "We are standing with heads tilted back, marveling. Luminous green, teal green, the aurora borealis glows almost directly overhead. It intensifies against the starry night like breath on a mirror, and it moves. Across the whole sky, from east to west, the green lights shift and alter. Now it's an emerald veil. Now with a surge, it remakes itself into a swizzle, which reaches towards some faraway place in the east." Now, this description encourages a sense of wonder and enchantment in response to natural phenomena such as these, but it also echoes what another nature writer, Philip Hoare, has talked about as a moment which jerks us out of our complacency. So here's Philip Hoare talking about the Perseids meteor shower here. He says, "Throughout the year, at key moments as we move through the orbits of fragmentary heavenly bodies, we can lie outside on the grass or a beach and watch the sky erupt. Nature is suddenly disrupted, and the disruption has nothing to do with us and our notional dominion. It is a spectacle older than us, setting our existence into salutary perspective. Such events still remind us that not everything is within our grasp or control." Now, Hoare's reference to this idea of notional dominion, I think, is an excellent shorthand for how we might come to resituate ourselves in the wider scheme of things, particularly in the Anthropocene. Of course, this can be complicated by the fact that the Anthropocene is also an acknowledgement that we are impacting the planet on a truly mammoth scale, but natural phenomena such as these remain important reminders that we are not at the center of things. If we are attentive to them, they can help place us as smaller elements in a far wider scheme than our own comparatively fleeting lives, and so can help us to acclimatize ourselves to concepts such as the Anthropocene by taking us out of ourselves. Now, we're generally accustomed to thinking about and considering history within a human time frame, and to periods of history which incorporate human inhabitation. However, we increasingly need to think about our place in the planet in a broader sense because the environmental changes which are happening force us to do this. And for many writers, this has involved increased thinking about deep time. Now, deep time has been around as a concept for a few centuries, but it's really gained ground in the Anthropocene as discussions about this have come to the fore. And to give a brief definition just from Robert Macfarlane here, deep time is the dizzyingly profound eras of Earth history that extend both behind and ahead of the present. So we can see how writers are trying to grapple with such an expansive idea in a variety of interesting ways, each providing us with alternative ways in to try and conceptualize these complex ideas. So as an example, a little bit later in the Aurora essay that I mentioned earlier, when reflecting on how the Vikings used to navigate by raven, Jamie wonders, maybe ravens had brought the Vikings here too in their Greenlandic voyages. She says, 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years, the blink of an eye. So this blurring of temporal scales is effective here as Jamie acclimatizes us to temporal slippages where time both expands and contracts, both to the time span of millennia and to the single blink of an eye. Now, if we can relate to the idea of being human thousands of years ago, then thinking of how comparatively close to us previous civilizations are in the broader temporal scheme could further acclimatize us to the more distant pasts required when thinking about deep time. Now, this in turn, I think, helps us to adjust to a more expansive sense of past and the future as well. We can also see this attempt to contend with meaning surrounding such expansive timescales in the work of Robert Macfarlane. In this excerpt from Underland, he witnesses the carving of an immense iceberg, which leads to the emergence of a rare black iceberg. And he writes, And then something terrible happens, which is that out of the water where the city has fallen, there upsurges rising, or so it seems from where we are standing, right to the summit of the carving face itself, a black, shining pyramid, sharp at its prow, thrusting and glistening, made of a substance that has to be ice, but looks like no ice we have ever seen before, something that resembles what I imagine meteorite metal to be, something that has come from so deep down in time that it has lost all color, and we are dancing and swearing and shouting, appalled and thrilled to have seen this repulsive, exquisite thing rise up that should never have surfaced, this star-dropped berg surge that has taken 3 minutes and 100,000 years to conclude. So the breathless flow of his words unravels here with the same speed as the event he is witnessing, as he tries to shock and unsettle the reader with just cause at this horrifying event. Now, this passage concludes with the jarring juxtaposition of the slow processes that ice has undergone over millennia at the speed at which this destructive event has taken place, so 3 minutes versus 100,000 years. So here we have another form of temporal compression, but one which takes on a far darker tone than Jamie's description from earlier. But this collision of different timescales can be viewed as a sort of Anthropocene metaphor, where humans are considered both as key agents of this change and also rendered largely irrelevant by it too. But in this way, I think we can also think of it as part of this new narrative of nature, and our place on the planet in an Anthropocene context, because it's one which again attempts to confront the inhuman scale of the transformation that is taking place around us after James Bradley, and its temporal, physical, and moral enormity. So when Macfarlane refers to and describes being appalled and thrilled to have seen this carving event, here he uses the terminology of the romantic sublime. And he also uses oxymorons which underscores the tensions which emerge from watching something which unfolds almost as a form of spectacle, whilst simultaneously being horrified by what it represents. So in this context, I wanted to include a quote from an Icelandic writer and environmental activist called Andri Snær Magnusson in what he calls mythological time. So he says, Earth's mightiest forces have forsaken geological time and now change on a human scale. He says changes that previously took 100,000 years now happen in 100 or 3 minutes. Such speed is mythological, he says. These changes surpass any of our previous experiences, surpass most of the language and metaphors which we use to navigate our reality. Now, both Jamie and Macfarlane are reaching towards this same sense of mythological time in their writing, but in differing ways. So how can we come to terms with such mythological time frames? How can we depend on language and metaphor to frame attempts to do this when the task seems so immense? Now, Macfarlane provides one suggestion to working through this idea, which I find quite useful. He points out the theorist Donna Haraway's justly famous phrase, which he says, for the task that faces us all is staying with the trouble. Now, Macfarlane adds, the trouble needs to be clearly seen and organized up and down the levels from local to global, and keeping hope, love, wonder, and the belief in possible betterment in view, this too is part of the work of staying with the trouble. Now, I see all of these writers in their own ways as responding to this call to stay with the trouble because they provide alternative ways in which this trouble can be brought more clearly into view. Now, I thought we could do a little bit of an experiment now. So, what Andri Snær Magnusson calls a thought experiment. So we need sort of maths heads on for the moment. So I'm going to ask a series of questions, which you'll need to answer yourselves, and at the end of it, you should have a number. It will be a rough number, more or less. It doesn't need to be exactly precise. And I'd like you to share this number or this figure with me at the end if you can, and I will explain why this is relevant shortly. Okay? So if you're ready, what I want you to do first of all is to think of the oldest grandparent in your family. I want you to think, what year were they born in? And how old are they now, or what age did they reach? Okay, so just think about that for a moment. And I want you to remember the year or that date in particular, okay? And then what I'd like you to do next is to think, if you live to the same age, what year might that potentially be? And if you have children, what about your potential grandchild? If your potential grandchild reaches the age that your grandparent is or did, what year might that be? Thinking ahead to the future. So, the year that your grandparent was born, your oldest grandparent, and if you have a child, how many years will it be till they get to the age that your grandparent potentially did? As I said, it can be rough figures. I'm not looking for really, really precise terms. So what you need to do is to think about the span of these two dates, these two sort of extremes of dates, okay? The date for your oldest grandparent when they were born, and the date when a potential child of yours has a grandchild that reaches that same sort of age. Do we have any tentative suggestions for some numbers?
Okay, so I took my mother. She's 89, and she was born in 1936.
Right.
Myself, I would be, I forgot the number now. And then I thought about my children. They're 17, and when their children are old, like my mother, for example, now, it will be 2,126. I don't think I need to tell my age, do I?
The rough figures are completely fine, yeah.
Yes, me too. I got about 200 years between the two dates.
Yeah.
No calculations? No?
There was one more just over here.
Ah, there you go. Careful, the cup.
Yeah, the final figure would be 250. My granddad died when he was 99. So, yeah, assuming like 70 years between like me and my grandchildren, that would be 250 between 1922 and 2170. So.
Yeah, great. Well done, everybody. So, I mean, I think, well, first of all, why have I asked you to do this? Well, because Snorre Magnusson, he says that essentially this is time that you can touch with your bare hands, okay? He calls this the arm's length of time. Now, just to give you an example, to break down the example that he gives, which is similar to many of the figures that you suggested, he thinks of his 94-year-old grandmother. She was born in 1924, and he asks his daughter to calculate the year when she will become also 94. And she does this experiment, and she finds out it's in the year 2102. And then he says, if your grandchild becomes around 90, reaches the age of around 90 years, what year is that? And she calculates to roughly the year 2170. And he says, imagine that somebody you will know somebody that's still alive in the year 2170, and not just vaguely. This will be a child that you've known for maybe 10 or even 15 years. And he says that time that you connect with personally, that time that you can touch with your bare hands is about 250 years. He says, my daughter can touch 1924 and 2170. That's almost 250 years. He says that's the arm's length. That's the personal connection to people and the intimate time of my daughter. Now, we've had Jamie compressing time to the blink of an eye, Macfarlane colliding timescales of the immediate and the distant, and this, I think, is another way to understand broader stretches of time. Of course, 250 years is far from reaching towards the idea of genuine deep time, but I think it is a useful reminder of timescales which are beyond our sort of conventional, usual human frame of reference. And so it's another way of helping to acclimatize us to concepts such as the Anthropocene and deep time, because it again takes us out of ourselves. It's also another way we can usefully contextualize our human experience on this broader scale, which I think is really important in the Anthropocene as we try to come to terms with the sorts of complexities of deep time as a concept which it often evokes. So in short, I think we can think of this thought experiment as a tool for making ideas of deep time seem less intangible, which I think is very, very important. Now, to return to this idea of deep time, in Underland, Macfarlane observes that viewed from the perspective of a desert or an ocean, human morality looks absurd. It's crushed to irrelevance. He says we should resist such inertial thinking. Indeed, we should urge its opposite. Deep time as a radical perspective, he says, provoking us to action and not apathy. Okay. So for Macfarlane here, narrative engagements with deep time can be viewed as radical provocations to action and to challenge feelings of numbness and to move towards forms of action. Now, I wanted to try and conclude today with a few thoughts about this question of action over apathy by turning to the third writer that I mentioned earlier, J. Griffiths. Now, Griffiths is a vocal member of Extinction Rebellion and also their literary branch called Writers Rebel. She's been arrested for her peaceful participation in non-violent climate protests and demonstrations. The photo here is from her arrest during an Extinction Rebellion protest in 2019. Now, as I mentioned earlier, her writing style is often polemical and highly emotive. As an active protester, she also views activism as a practice and an attitude which can be present in her writing as well. Now, it's her writing which she considers her first proverbial line of defense against the environmental crisis, as her skill lies in storytelling and narrative, and also in constructing experience with and through words. Now, she said the job of a good writer is to be a good messenger for others, even if that is difficult. But it does also raise the question of what can we do when we feel like words maybe aren't enough? Are there times when the narratives we reach for seem insufficient or somehow hopeless? Now, in her 2021 essay collection, Why Rebel, she says, the magnitude of this situation silences me. The words I lean towards are not enough. Tears maybe, the raw scream of rage and pity perhaps. But what words do you suggest that I use here? Annihilation, the end of worlds, the last generation, absolute apocalypse. If you are looking this full in the face, what expresses it sufficiently? And a savage anger overcomes me. Now, here I see this once again, recalling Snare Magnusson with the idea that the changes that are happening surpass most of the language and the metaphors we use to navigate our reality. And so in the scale of this all, what is enough and what can we do? I think it's very important to acknowledge these feelings of fear, frustration, anger, and hope, and say, what can we do? So I wanted to focus on this question of hope. And this sliding scale of feelings of hope and hopelessness at times, which I think reflects an experience we all recognize having to varying degrees in the context of the environmental crisis. Now, often responses to the environmental crisis are framed in a sort of tension between hope versus despair. Now, what I think is useful for us today is that Griffiths actually has a different angle on this scale of hope versus despair. And what she says is, hope paralyzes, and she says, alarm galvanizes. Now, in her view, hope is almost immobilizing. It can paralyze, but for her, alarm is something which can galvanize. So evoking alarm is, in fact, potentially more conducive to action. So this is, I think, why she also takes a far more polemical approach in her own writing, this sort of trying to alarm into a form of action. So perhaps this is something that we can think about now, the idea that alarm or raising alarm, rather than creating despair, might also be seen as a form of rallying for action. A rallying cry for action for times when hope maybe seems insufficient somehow in the scale of the difficulties we face, which themselves can sometimes seem insurmountable, and the complexities of the narratives and the shifts in language which we need to grapple with. Now, by some way of a conclusion, I wanted to end by saying I think it's vital that the crisis speaks to people in as many ways as possible. So I think a variety of different approaches is important if we are to address the issues we face with the urgency that is required. Now, in this context, I like to think of something which another new nature writer called Tim Dee said once, where he said, "Desperate times call for disparate measures." Now, I've underlined today this idea of staying with the trouble, the acknowledgement and acceptance of how things are, but the importance of thinking about hope in terms of what this writing and what alternative narratives can do. So we have these different aspects of what hope can mean. And for another aspect of hope, I just wanted to end with this idea of hope which maybe stretches over a broader time frame. So I wanted to end with a quote from the US writer and activist Rebecca Solnit from her brilliant book called Hope in the Dark. So she's argued that the effect of writing is often indirect and delayed. She says, you write your books, you scatter your seeds, rats might eat them or they might rot. In California, some seeds lie dormant for decades because they only germinate after fire. And she says, and sometimes the burned landscape blooms most lavishly. So on that note, I'd like to say thank you. And yes. And do you have any questions at this stage?
May I ask a question?
Yes, absolutely.
So this concept on like hope paralyzes but alarm galvanizes. Are there other examples like that where you can say, how can you use language that doesn't just crush everything, but that makes you want to do stuff?
Well, there are a variety of ways which this is kind of unhappening and unfolding, and one of the things to do with this question of language is that many writers are really thinking critically about the sorts of words that we use. One of Macfarlane's earlier texts, called Landmarks, which was published in 2015, is essentially a glossary of words which he uses to talk about aspects of the natural world which may be disappearing, and the idea that when we have words to talk about these things, they become less generic and they become something that we are a bit more engaged and interested with. But he also uses many terms to talk about the sort of new Anthropocene narrative, to acknowledge the sorts of things that we maybe don't want to see, but are still happening. He talks about something called plastiglomerate, for example, this kind of composite material which is emerging in the Anthropocene. So it's a question of the words and terms which, in a way, we can attach to this idea of enchantment and disenchantment as well, the sort of important duality of looking at terms which provide hope, terms which maybe acknowledge despair, but which should be some kind of motivation for saying we don't want this to carry on this way, a sort of alternative path, perhaps. Yeah.
Yes.
In this perspective of how language can transfer messages and the need by writers to be messengers, do you think that research or the scientific world should harmonize with the writers in order to convey urgency for change? Do you think do you think principles from the literature world should kind of merge with the goals of scientific research? Do you see this collaboration amplifying both words' objectives?
Yes, I mean, this is certainly what's happening, particularly with the sort of acknowledgement of the Anthropocene and what's going on. And what is happening with many of the nature writers, that they're increasingly come to collaborate with scientists, because many scientists are saying that they're publishing papers with sort of meticulous, precise scientific language that is raising the alarm, but it doesn't seem to be being amplified by society at large, by the media, in ways that it should. And in some ways, it's also actively sort of underplayed. So there is a sense of this collaboration that is necessary. But also, I've seen, in the past sort of decade or so, the attitudes of the writers themselves drastically shifting. Some of them, maybe 10 or so years ago, were more reluctant to be associated with forms of activism or to be labeled as activists as writers, because they distinguished, what's going on in their writing and activism as a different sort of thing. But what's really happened in recent years is that sort of distinction seems to have mostly eroded, and this is why this kind of sense of urgency is really coming to the fore much more, with these writers trying to collaborate and engage with people from all walks of life, from all sorts of forms of expertise, just to do what they can to sort of amplify this message and to try and get it heard more widely. Yeah.
On the note of amplifying messages, one of the things Philip did this morning, I thought really impressed, and that's my question on how important is the timing. When you came with the picture of the queen of bumblebees and those flowers and the visualization added to it, you look at it and you think, wow. Like the impact is even much, much bigger. So what can you say about timing? And maybe that would be also a takeaway for scientists or for us to take with if next time we're on stage and we have to bring something forward. I just thought the bumblebee and the way you brought it across, that was really breathtaking. It was like, wow. Anything to add? What were your thoughts?
I'm glad you enjoyed it. But there's one thing I would like to highlight here also. I think I liked Robert McFarlane because he stays very close to where we live. Mm-hmm. If I have to go and travel to the coral reefs, I fly to the other side of the world. If I want to see the lights in the Arctic, I have to fly to the Arctic. And Robert McFarlane, he really looks at the stuff that's around us. And one thing also I would like, or allow me to tell you here, there is one more book or one more concept in architecture. You talk about cohabitation, and I think that's very close also to the narratives of nature and how human beings intervene with nature. And it is a very hopeful concept that we can really find a way that humans and nature can live together. It won't be the same way as it is in the coral reefs. It has to change, but it shows a new perspective. And then there is this other concept called zoopolis. You might have heard of this before. That's Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka. They wrote a book about zoopolis, and they are concerned about the interaction of animals, plants, and humans. And what they say is we have so many liminal species today. It's like all those cows that live with us, they evolved with the human beings. And they are now, the human beings, they have a responsibility for all those animals. And we have to find a new relation in this way. That can really help us to understand the world and also to make sure that it will continue. So I think these are two very helpful concepts. If you want to do something, I suggest reading those books.
Those were the concepts, and the question was, what can I do operationally on the timing? Is there anything to...
Well, maybe less in terms of this question of timing, but in terms of location, perhaps, what you were mentioning about sort of McFarlane resonating because he's writing about the sort of closer to home. There's also been a general sort of shift in the idea of narratives. I think, for example, of the way that in terms of the responsibility that the media has to kind of communicate these ideas. The Guardian in particular, a few years ago, really started to shift and talked consciously about how they needed to change the way that they frame the narrative of the environmental crisis. Because very often, environmental crisis as a sort of visual metaphor was demonstrated by a single polar bear floating alone on an iceberg, for example. This was the kind of imagery that they used to try and convey the ecological crisis. And in fact, what they've done is tried to say, well, this is an approach which in many ways actually alienates people because they don't feel that it's connected enough to them and to their sort of daily reality. Whereas in many respects, you see with forest fires, flooding, you see this really coming to people's front doors. So they're changing the narrative by changing the kind of imagery of the narrative they use as well to show that the environmental crisis is something that affects people, that affects cities just as much as it does the more than human world, be it close or further away from us as well. And also something else to say about that question is sometimes some of Griffith's earlier writing was criticized for precisely the kind of idea that she goes to far-flung locations, which are distant for many of us. And there's the kind of assumption in that that she's sort of pushed back at the criticism because what she's trying to do in many of those narratives is actually writing about the place which is home for people from another perspective. So it's kind of shifting and having the idea that home is not just the sort of the familiar for you, but trying to remind you that home for other people, for the more than human world, is all over the place. So the kind of idea of this shifting center as well is also what she says actually she's trying to do. But absolutely, this kind of question of going to far-flung places is an interesting one, and something again in the past 10 or 15 years that has shifted in the narrative as well, because I think it's very important that the writers, when they do that, they need to talk and acknowledge the kind of carbon footprint they have. They're not just going to some far-flung place to report back on sort of dire environmental consequences, but they also need to recognize the sort of environmental impact that their sort of traveling can do. But whether or not you think writers as a sort of mouthpiece for talking about broader issues have more of a carte blanche or something is it's a broader question as well. But yeah,
I'll toss it.
So following up to what you just said, you mentioned The Guardian, and we saw at the beginning that these kind of writers are kind of niche in the sense that the general public, the broader public, is not really familiar with them, while, for example, I saw in a previous slide there was a passage that was from The Guardian, and you also talked about how they changed the narrative about the ecological crisis and the climate crisis in general. And I was wondering if, also in light of the activism of some of these writers, if it was maybe possible, effective, if it's already happening, like instead of of course, like writing books and essays and so on, like if having pieces in newspapers or journals that are with a much broader audience, isn't it more effective? And if it is, which kind of take-home message should people get from these, or what is that this writer want to communicate, if it's not to someone that is already kind of interested and into this word, but just comes across a piece in a newspaper that, as I say, for people that are not accustomed to reading these kind of things and not of the sector in general.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, because sort of one of the criticisms maybe about sort of some of the environmental discourse is the idea that, our are we just preaching to the converted? How do you get these messages across to the people that really need to change, the people that have the sort of the power? And I mean, it's a tricky question, but I mean, in some respects, you think about the ways in which the writers are trying to engage across sort of multiple media. They're now no longer just sort of publishing literary texts. I mean, Macfarlane, for example, he works on documentaries, he collaborates with musicians, he has a very broad reach, and he sort of talked about this response about maybe being criticized as sort of writing for a select few individuals, as saying the idea of endorsing a kind of naive pastoralism, he says, it's anathema to me. So I really think about this question of this idea of disparate times and disparate measures, and how the writers are really trying to do all that they can to kind of branch out and really sort of engage with people that need to listen. But that's one of the greatest challenges, really. This, how do you get these messages to talk to power, to talk to sort of broader inaction? Yeah.
Okay, so I was just going to add that this is something you can add as a teacher, English teacher with literature, discussions about the environment inside of your classroom. I mean, not you, but a teacher can bring this kind of literature, and that's where there's some power to touch the bigger, larger, public that may not have that discussion at home or may not be part of our little community. I was just thinking last night, my daughters, they're 17, and they told me, Mom, we're so lucky we had you. We were in Bern, on the climate fight when we were little kids, and that's because of you. And most of our friends are telling, yeah, there's climate change, but let's do nothing because it's already done, and we can just enjoy life now. And because they feel like there's nothing to be done because it's so heavy. And they're just going to go on polluting, buying the fast car, and I don't know what material things. So in fact, because we cannot talk about religion, we cannot talk about spirituality in schools, which is normal, of course, because we must be laic or whatever we are. At least we can speak about something that's close to spirituality through the literature. And I think that's the role of it turns out to be, I'm American, so it would be the role of the English teachers. Here it's the role of the French teachers. So yeah, I hope for that, and I hope that there will be, because our studies are like that. There's math, there's French, there's German, I don't know what, there's no discussion about the environment, there's no place to talk about the larger issues, and the young generation is quite lost, and we need people to transfer these messages through the literature, because they're not just preaching, they're just telling the story. What do you think about this? Let them discuss. I think that's the best we can do for the general public.
Yeah, I think absolutely, and also, along this same sort of vein about what role this writing or the movement of nature writing, more generally speaking, can do. You don't always know what is going to work and what is going to be the sort of the straw that breaks the camel's back. What is going to kind of speak to one person over another? And I think Macfarlane has spoken about this, and he said, literature works in a cat's cradle of cause and effect. So you don't always necessarily have something which has immediate action, but you can have the sort of trickle-down action, which may also impact in a number of ways, which is why I think it's so important that you have these writers thinking of these different kind of perspectives and different ways that the narrative can reach and sort of branch out with so many other fields, but also generations as well, because trying to speak to the younger generation is absolutely crucial as well.
It just needs to happen fast enough, I would assume.
Yes, yeah.
All right, I'm looking at the time. What do you say? Shall we wrap it up?
Yeah, I mean, unless you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Desperate times, desperate measures. Do you truly believe that strategically poetry could be effective?
That what could be effective, sorry?
Poetry.
Poetry. Well, I'm not talking specifically about poetry here. I'm sort of talking about, I mean, generally speaking, when I'm talking about nature writing here, I'm talking about non-fiction. But I mean, nature writing in general can sort of morph and include basically all genres, and I think they all have something very important to say. In terms of this question of poetry, I think Kathleen Jamie, for example, she's an incredible prose writer. She is primarily trained as a poet, and I think her astute eye and her astute way of communicating and engaging with narratives and thinking about, she's really, really good at finding metaphors which really kind of help to put sort of concepts on a broader scale and to make them more understandable and relatable, which she translates into her non-fiction. But this really comes, it's rooted in her sort of skill as a poet and in her poetry as well. And you can see many of the things that she does in her non-fiction are really echoes of what she does in her poetry as well. So I think in terms of this question, that there's not a sort of a clear divide, but there's really very much a sort of dialogue in between these different forms. And I think poetry can do something very, very powerful. But you know, in terms of speaking to a broader audience, I think it's absolutely you tend to have more opportunity to engage and interact and communicate with a broader audience if you switch to sort of prose or non-fiction in these sorts of examples as well. Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emmy Player, for being here, being with us. Are you staying for lunch?
Yes.
Wonderful. Then please snatch her and talk to her about these super interesting topics. Thank you so much for being here. We are taking a break, and we're going to do a next panel at 2:30, and it's going to be on food and supply chains. Thank you.